Taoist Metaphysics. According to tradition, Lao Tzu, who is reputed to have lived in the 4th to 6th century, literal translation of his name would be Old Master, he supposedly wrote the Tao Te Ching. Now, he's considered by most experts in Taoism to be a kind of a compilation, in the sense that there probably wasn't a particular individual named Lao Tzu who wrote the Tao Te Ching. Rather, it'd be similar to Homer, how Homer's, the authorship of the Iliad and the Odyssey is attributed to Homer, although it most likely had far other sources and compiled together. And so it seems likely that there was no particular Lao Tzu, rather the Tao Te Ching, this book, was a compilation. Although there are those who claim that there was a Lao Tzu, and they offer some evidence that apparently he met Confucius. So that's still a point of dispute. Now, Taoism exists both as a religion and as a philosophy. Our focus, of course, will be on Taoism as a philosophy, looking at specifically Taoist metaphysics, focusing on the Tao. Not the Dow Jones, of course, but the Tao. So, what is the Tao? Well, in many ways, the Tao is quite mysterious. The Tao, according to the Taoists, it's not known where it came from, although it's believed to have existed before heaven and earth. And in terms of naming the Tao, they're, again, kind of mysterious, almost riddle-like assertions that the Tao that can be, trodden is not the enduring and unchanging Tao. The name that can be named is not the enduring and unchanging name. And the Taoists claim that it can be seen as the originator of heaven and earth, also the mother of all things, and the same under both aspects. So pretty mysterious. And again, it has many names, such as, according to the Taoists, we look but do not see it, and name it the equable. We listen and do not hear it, and name it the inaudible. We fail to grasp it, and name it the subtle. With these qualities, it cannot be described, and hence we blend them together to obtain the one. Its name is not known. So what it's designated as is the Tao, which a rough translation would be the way, or the course. It is called great, and it may be named in the smallest and the greatest. So rather mysterious. So what kind of qualities or lack of qualities does this have? Well, one metaphor that's commonly used by the Taoists is to compare the Tao to water. And they say that the highest excellence is like that of water. How so? Well, what water does is that instead of, struggling when it encounters an obstacle, it either just simply goes around it rather than just, beating itself against it stupidly, or it just gradually wears it down. So water always takes the easy route, the non-difficult route, avoiding, if it hits the rock, it simply goes around. Now, it's important not to mistake the way of water with just being, a slacker, with being, unwilling to, put in the work. So what the Taoists are saying is not, slack and take the, the easy way out in the negative sense, like the sloppy way out. Essentially what they seem to be saying is, what the Tao does is, rather than take the needlessly difficult way, it takes the way of least resistance. And this, is often taken as sort of a guide to how people should deal with life. That one should emulate the Tao, so instead of, going and seeking out obstacles and taking the most needlessly difficult way possible, why not take the way of least difficulty? Again, it's not about doing it like a slacker way or, a way that is just doing it halfway. It's essentially, why do things in a needlessly difficult way? To use kind of like a example, think about dealing with people. If you work with people, everyone's got buttons and everyone's got, triggers that set them off. And if you're working with someone, and imagine you've got like two options. One thing will set them off and lead to conflict and trouble needlessly. But it will just set them off. The other way will not, and things will go well. So what do you do? Well, the Taoist way, of course, would be to not set them off and create needless, difficulty. Again, so the way of water is not just sort of, halfway doing things and slacking, but avoiding doing needless conflict. And so that would be like the Tao. Now, in terms of the other qualities of the Tao, again, it's super mysterious and in many ways seemingly inconsistent. For example, the Taoists say things like, its upper part is not bright, and its lower part is not obscure. It again returns and becomes nothing. This is called the form of the formless, the semblance of the invisible, and the fleeting and indeterminable. It is still and formless. It stands alone, undergoing no change, reaching everywhere, but yet in no danger of exhaustion. It's all-pervading, on the left and on the right. And it also is taken as passing on, not in the sense of like dying, like it's passed on, but it's in constant flow. And so, again, in speaking and seeming somewhat like riddle things, passing on it becomes remote, becoming remote it returns. So how do we interact with the Tao? Well, again, it'll seem sort of unusual. We meet it and do not see its front. We follow it, do not see its back. And so, again, pretty mysterious. But it does seem to do some important things. So what is one sort of role or function of the Tao? Well, it seems to have an important role in the law of reality. And so one basic question of metaphysics is, how does the world work? What makes it work, seemingly consistently? One answer we saw in part 2, talking about religion and philosophy, one approach is to have God organize the world. This is a teleological approach, that there's a purpose behind what occurs. And Taoism also embraces teleology, or purpose. But the Tao doesn't seem to be like God, like in the Christian sense. But, according to the Taoists, we humans take our law from the earth. The earth takes its law from heaven, not like in the Christian heaven, but, the idea of like here would be earth, and then sort of the realm beyond heaven. And according to the Taoists, heaven takes its law from the Tao. So the Tao is the law of everything. So indirectly, our laws, the way reality works, comes from the Tao. And the law of the Tao is being what it is. So what else does the Tao do? Well, according to the Taoists, it is ceaseless in its action. And again, it occupies kind of a godlike role. All things, the Taoists claim, depend on it for their production to exist, and all things obey it. And one thing that's kind of an integral part of Taoism, as a philosophy and also as a religion, is sort of a humbleness. Because when the Tao's work is accomplished, it does not claim to have done it. So one thing that's considered to be sort of a mark of like the Taoist Sage is that they do what is to be done and accomplish their work, but do not brag about it. In fact, do not even claim to have done it. It is enough to have it done. Also, the Taoists say that the Tao clothes all things, but does not assume to be their lord. So the Tao does not take a command over them. And again, the Taoist sage, the wise person, takes a similar approach, namely, presumably helping all, but not assuming to rule over them. Now, one key concept of Taoism is the idea of doing without doing, of, doing nothing, in a strange sort of way. According to the Taoists, the Tao does nothing for the sake of doing it, and so there is nothing it does not do. So the idea here, which some people interpret as this, that the Tao does without doing, and we'll see more of this later. Now, the Taoists also contain, or Taoism contains a strong, well, I don't want to say a moral aspect, because in other parts of the Tao Te Ching, they, claim that evil and good are sort of, in a way, a bad thing. They arise, they're a worsening. And in many ways, this is sort of can be seen as analogous to the story of the Garden of Eden. Things were best before there was good and evil is kind of a step down. And the Taoists claim that if, rulers, could maintain the Tao, that things would be good. Then there's a common thing in not only Taoism but also Confucianism about the importance of morality or following the proper way in the rulers. So, simplicity is also a key part of the Tao, and they describe it as lacking desire, at rest and still, but yet all things go right. And in the seeming paradox, the movement of the Tao goes by contraries. Now, the Taoist Sage also tries to emulate this, that to do without doing. And again, more on this in a bit. Another paradox is that the Tao is weak, but this weakness marks the course of the Tao's mighty deeds, which seems like a paradox. These mighty deeds are from weakness. And Taoism is often, noted for that kind of unusual tendency to, accept kind of these opposites, which not surprising that you have the symbol there which combines opposites. And so according to the Taoists, the Tao is also the mother of all things. How so? Well, in kind of the Taoist creation story, the Tao produced one produced two produced three produced all things. So the Tao is the creator. And according to the Taoists, all things embrace the brightness, and some things are increased by being diminished, and others are diminished by being increased. So, again, lots of seeming paradoxes. So, the Tao, creates everything. And as the Tao Te Ching says, all things under heaven sprang from it as existing and named, and existence sprang from it as non-existent and not named. And so, it does a lot of stuff. Now, there's also, of course, the Taoist Sage, which I've mentioned, but let's turn to look at the Sage. The Taoist Sage. Essentially, the Taoist Sage manifests the Tao. Now, we saw that the Tao does without doing, and the Sage follows the Tao and does without doing. So what does that mean? Well, again, it's not that the Sage or the Tao are, slackers and not doing stuff. What it means is this. According to the Taoists, and again, this will seem very sort of poetical and sound very like, riddle-like, the Sage is able to manage things without doing anything, and is able to convey their instructions without speech. And in a quote from the Tao Te Ching, the work is done, but no one can see how. So the idea is that the Sage, through this wisdom understanding of the Tao, is able to make things happening without doing things. Now again, this is not like slacking, it's that the person has such an understanding of the way that they're able to get things done without putting in, conflicting effort or compelling or forcing things, because they understand the way of things. And they're able to convey their instructions without telling people what to do. And this would be, a very masterful, person, because they can get things done. They don't have to force or compel people. And it can be seen, in a very good way, that it's someone who would guide without compulsion or forcing people, without having to tell them what to do. I mean, think of, for example, if you've ever had the good fortune to be part of a really good team, either in sports or work, and have a really good teamwork, and maybe someone who's like, kind of the leader of the group, and you all know exactly what to do. You all do it. It all goes well. You don't have to talk and force and compel people, but it just works smoothly. You're in like the team zone, and that's what Taoism would seem to be. You're in the zone, and it's not like awkward and struggling and force and compulsion, like where you're in a really bad team or a bad workplace. Everything goes well because everything is acting in accord with its way. So this involves becoming the sage, involves possessing the Tao. To know, this unchanging rule of the Tao. And according to the Taoists, to know the unchanging rule of the Tao is to be intelligent. And to not know it, again, going back to that kind of flailing and chaos and stuff, it leads to what they call wild movements and evil issues. Basically, going against the way and nature of things leads to conflict. And the knowledge of these unchanging rules, the way of things, according to the Taoists, produces forbearance. And this leads to community, a feeling with all things. And from this community comes a kingliness of character. And someone who is king-like goes on to be heaven-like. And in that likeness to heaven, they possess the Tao. So again, going back to the kind of the metaphor of being in the zone, if someone is wise and they grasp the way of things, then it's not chaos, it's not disorder, it's not force or madness or conflict or wildness. Things are smooth and in the zone. Again, if you've ever been fortunate enough to be in a group or in a team that gets in the zone, be it in sports or work or anything like that, where everything just goes perfectly smoothly, everyone is doing exactly what they need to do on the team. You don't have to yell and scream and cause trouble and force stuff. It's just all zone, if only for a short time. And so having Taoism, being the sage, would be like, being in the zone. Ideally, always in the zone. So, seems pretty good. And again, the reason for this, according to the Tao, is that there's a way to everything, and the Taoist sage understands that. They understand the way of things, so they know how they should be, how they should act. Now, also under Taoism is the notion that when someone has the Tao, they endure long and until death. They're exempt from decay. And there were legends and tales of Taoist immortals. Now, were there really Taoists who lived forever? Well, that sounds kind of, supernatural, sounds kind of fantastic. So, probably not. So where did this idea come from? Why were there notions of Taoist immortals? Well, some people who reject the metaphysical notion that the Tao enables people to truly live a long time or live forever, they point to some very reasonable things. One thing is that the Taoists generally tended to eat a diet that would be fairly healthy. Also, if you look at what has been discussed under Taoism, the idea is to avoid conflict and stress and all this bad stuff. And we know now that people who avoid stress and who are calm and meditate, etc., they are healthier. They do live longer. So it could be that the notion of Taoist immortals, perhaps is somewhat exaggerated, but the idea that people who have this sort of peace does seem consistent with current science stuff. Now, much like the Buddhists, they do note that they do focus a bit on desires, and their view is to kind of keep it simple. That someone whose desires are few gets them, and someone whose desires are many goes astray. So then, what about the sage? Well, according to the Taoist sage embraces humility and manifests it to all. Free of self-display, they shine. Free from self-assertion, they are distinguished. Free from self-boasting, their merit is acknowledged. Free from self-complacency, they acquire superiority. Free from striving, no one in the world is able to strive with them. So, again, seemingly sort of paradoxes that by being, humble, they shine. not asserting themselves or boasting. They're distinguished and acknowledged. And again, this seems just to be a case of someone being, in the metaphor, in the zone. So think of, if you're lucky to know a person like this, think of someone who is like that. They don't brag. They don't really, they don't boast. They're not always like having to, get into conflicts with people. They're not complacent. Yet they shine, and their merit is acknowledged, and they're seen, they're recognized and able to do things without, conflict and brutality, etc. And such people, unfortunately, seem to be quite rare. But that would be the Taoist Sage. And the idea is that they have metaphysical attunement. Now, as you might kind of guess, George Lucas borrowed the idea of the Force from Taoism. Now, it's not that the Taoists believe that people can learn to shoot, force lightning from their hands, or lift things with telekinesis, etc. But the idea is that when someone is in tune with the Tao, they would have this, special attunement, able to accomplish these things. But again, no forced lightning or that stuff. So Lucas obviously took some license with that. So according to the Taoists, the Tao is great, heaven is great, earth is great, and the sage is also great. So those are the four things that are great. And the sage is able, again with the seeming paradox, by not making themselves great, to accomplish great things. So the sage is the opposite of a narcissist, the opposite of a megalomaniac, the opposite of someone who's an authoritarian. It is someone who is none of those things. And yet, or perhaps more likely because of this, they're able to accomplish great things without needless struggle or conflict. To finish up on Taoist metaphysics, taking us back in some ways to our good dead friend Plato, that knowledge, the many and the one, according to the Taoists, knowledge of one thing gives knowledge of the opposite. And sometimes the Taoists are criticized, or perhaps sometimes lauded, for being critical of knowledge, of certain types. So, for example, knowledge of beauty gives knowledge of ugliness. Knowledge of skill gives knowledge of the lack of skill. Knowledge of existence gives knowledge of non-existence. Knowledge of difficulty gives knowledge of ease. Knowledge of length gives knowledge of shortness. Knowledge of height gives knowledge of lowness. Musical notes and tones become harmonious to the relation of one another, and knowledge of being before gives knowledge of being behind. And so with those cryptic statements, we come to the end of metaphysics.